Good morning, or afternoon, I guess, as it is now. Everybody can hear me. I usually don't use a microphone, but I guess I will. I've been accused of having sort of a loud, obnoxious voice, so we'll try to make it work, I guess, with the microphone. So I did this last spring as well, I think maybe early summer last year, so some of you may have been here for that presentation, generally the same one, with a little different twist on it. My background, as Bart sort of mentioned, was both in the private sector, the public sector, and now in academics. So I've done a little bit of everything. But a lot of my work in the private sector and the development side was administering permits for private developers and private home builders in the suburbs. So for better or worse, I was involved in sprawl for 5 years. So I know how it works, right? I know how the process works. But I also, at the same time, worked for the county, and I work in academics now, and I know the levers that can be pushed at the municipal level for citizen planners that are interested in making change in their own communities. So with that being said, let me just ask how many people here are City of Buffalo residents? It's usually a big chunk. And then the rest, I would assume, are suburban residents? Yes? Yes? Okay. Niagara. It's a suburb of Buffalo. It's the largest city in Niagara County, so let's not have a semantic argument yet. See, I've already touched a nerve, and I'm like 3 minutes in. So it sounds about right. It sounds about right. So from our perspective, what happens locally, whether it's at suburbs or cities or towns or villages, is critically important to achieving sustainable outcomes, right? So I'm really here kind of to talk about why do we plan, and then sort of how do we plan, right? And planning is really, really about two very important things: the interconnected nature of the built environment, and also its complexity, right? So when we think about Erie and Niagara County, we're talking about tens of municipalities, 64 individual communities. In a lot of ways, those communities act in their own fashion to achieve their own needs and their own outcomes. So trying to plan for 64 places at once is very, very complex, but they are interrelated. They have a relationship in this space, in this region. It's really, really hard to plan regionally, as we've all sort of known forever, to get everyone pushing the ball in the same direction for better regional outcomes. So from my perspective, better regional outcomes might be thinking about the One Region Forward plan, the framework for regional growth, and then how can we implement those plans locally, right? As citizen planners in the communities that we live in, how do we push the levers we have in our own communities to achieve sustainable outcomes? So this is what we know, right? This is why we're trying to think a little bit more sustainable with regard to our future as residents of this two-county region, right? As we continue to grow and grow and grow in terms of the developed urbanized area in this region, another phenomenon has happened, and that is basically we're losing population, right? So there represents kind of a paradox, right? We continue to develop more and more acreage, but we continue to lose more and more people. So it's not really necessarily a sustainable outcome. So with that growth comes more stuff, right? So as we continue to grow and grow and grow as a municipality, as a region, we continue to build more infrastructure. And the cost of that infrastructure then has to be passed on and borne by all of us. So more lane miles means more cost per capita, right? We're building more infrastructure that, in theory, we don't necessarily need, but we're building it, and we therefore have to maintain it with a continually smaller population. So the cost gets borne by all. The other issue is, and this is kind of where my current sort of main area of focus and research is really on this idea of vacancy. How are we going to manage vacancy as we move forward? And part of the management of vacancy is actually try to find a way to not make it happen so often, right? Maybe more infill development, more reusing the existing infrastructure we have. But the outcome or the manifestation of sprawl and the development pattern we have now is evidently clear in this map of vacancy rates from 1970 to 2010, right? We're seeing a larger and larger portion of vacancy. The more telling thing here, and this is what I would like to point out to somebody who said Niagara Falls, and there's people from all suburban communities here, I would assume, vacancy is no longer a City of Buffalo issue. It's not just Buffalo's problem anymore. It's creeping into our first-ring suburbs, so the Tonawandas, the West Senecas, big issue in Cheektowaga, and we're starting to see it be a substantial issue in our sort of external or ex-urb older village centers, the Springvilles, Gowandas. We're starting to see some of it in Kenmore, right? We're seeing it in older communities in Niagara County like Barker and things like that. Those places aren't, they're not the agricultural centers that they used to be. They're kind of falling through the economy a little bit. And so the vacancy issue is becoming pervasive rather than internally, spatially focused in the city only. So it's an issue. So the challenge then for us becomes, how do we manage all of this complex nature of 64 municipalities? And then how do you as citizen planners go into your communities and work within what we hope to be a regional framework and regional decisions and better thinking about regional outcomes? How do we manage that locally, right? So locally what we have here is 64 cities, towns, and villages, right? And each of those 64 entities tends to make decisions based on what's best for the individual municipality. It's basically political geography, right? You vote someone into office to make decisions on what's best for that municipality. It would be altruistic of us to say, well, we should also make decisions based on what's best for everybody. It's hard to do that, right? It's hard to say, well, let's spend more of our money to make the adjacent municipality better off, right? It's a hard thing to do. So citizen planners can play a role in that, right? So the reality becomes that there are tools, right? There are systems and structures in place for citizen planners and residents and grassroots organizations to work within those communities to try to turn local decision-making towards more sustainable or better regional outcomes, right? And the issue becomes really that all municipalities, whether cities, towns, or villages, they're all enabled by state law to make land use decisions by themselves without any consideration for adjacent communities or the region as a whole. It's kind of the fault of home rule authority, right? So if you live in a local community and you vote, then you know that all planning is purely politics, right? Working with planning sort of endeavors in your community and working with politicians always tend to fall back to political decisions. And that can be troublesome and problematic, and we'll try to sort of think of a way to work around that. So I have two graphs here, and these are, I don't want to get all mathy and way deep into economics, but here's why governments essentially continue to seek growth, right? Which is, this is just following simple business economics or way firms would operate. The initial investment that a firm makes to produce a product makes the cost of every single product expensive, right? But if you can sell more of those products, the more you sell, the more profit you make, the less expensive each one of those products becomes, right? Economies of scale. The same argument is made for municipalities, right? That just if you had a blank slate of acreage and you were going to build a street and you had to provide a school and a city hall and a police department and a fire department, the cost per person if you had 10 people move into this first municipality would be very, very expensive. But the more people you add, you create an economy of scale, and the cost gets driven down to the point where you reach an equilibrium where it says that the number of people you have exactly meets the lowest price you're going to pay to deliver those services. Pretty bland sort of idea, right? Pretty simple. The bottom line is, eventually you have to reinvest. Growth doesn't always mean continual decline in the per capita tax rate in your community. Eventually, you have to regrow again. You're adding more streets, more cop cars, more teachers, more schools, more everything. And the cost of that initial investment gets borne by the 3,001 people. When you reach that threshold and you pass over it, the per person price of taxes goes back up. So governments tend to chase this constantly because it'll peak again and will drop again. And so it becomes a perpetual chase. Capitalism has to keep growing, right, to feed itself. So this is what governments tend to do. And it's even worse when we add in decline, right? So City of Buffalo, I see Nadine's here, 580,000 people at one point, way more than half of that now gone, same built environment, right? So it does have the same effect. The cost per person goes up, but you're not getting the growth to come with it. So maybe the sustainable outcome looks more like this. Maybe the reality is that when we add more population, if we do it in more infill manner and reinvest in the places we already have infrastructure, right? Or we do it in places, or we do it in a manner in the rural communities and the ex-urban communities where the density is smaller and we're building actually less infrastructure than more. Maybe the curve becomes this. Maybe sustainability starts to look more like this, where the rise in rates isn't as steep, and we don't keep peaking back at the top before we get back down into the valley, right? So maybe that's what sustainability really looks like. So how do we achieve local sustainable outcomes that are beneficial for us as a region, right? And so we'll walk through a few of the things that that you might be familiar with or you might be learning for the first time today, right? So the first and most important thing in most communities is a comprehensive plan. And this woman right here just told me that the town of West Seneca is engaging in redeveloping their comprehensive plan. Significant tool, major tool, right? Hopefully in most communities that are engaging in comprehensive plan, they're doing it with the public, right? That's where you come in. So the comprehensive plan is a large area plan that covers the entire municipality. It's long-term. Sometimes you've seen them from as small as a 10-year window to a 20-year window. I mean, when you get beyond 20 years, I would argue you're making too much of a grasp at the time frame, and it should be a little bit shorter. It should guide development. And the most important thing from your perspective as citizen planners is this is your vision, right? This is the place where you as citizens get engaged in the process of determining the future of your community and helping create and then codify that vision, right? Hopefully the comp plan gets adopted and becomes an official blueprint for the community, and decisions that are made at the political level follow this plan. Not always the case. Not always the case. A lot of communities will develop a comprehensive plan and it never actually gets adopted. There's some idea, well, I don't want to tie myself to that, right? It takes 2 years to make it, and the board that decided to expend the dollars to create the comp plan gets pushed out of office, and the new board says, I don't want to tie myself to that, right? So sometimes they don't get adopted. So in the best case, they get adopted. You create the vision, it gets adopted and gets pushed forth. So this is the opportunity for individuals in any given community to really create the vision that becomes the lever that hopefully the politicians are using. In some cases, City of Buffalo, most of the stuff in here is City of Buffalo because they have all the different kinds of pieces that go into planning for a community, right? So area plans are another one, right? So City of Buffalo does it for its parks, for its waterfront, and for its downtown, right? So if you're in a municipality, a lot of municipalities are doing downtown comprehensive plans, even in small rural villages. Another key way to leverage your involvement into better outcomes, right? So some communities want their downtown to look a certain way. The facades have to be designed a certain way, a certain amount of glass. That decision should be one, again, that citizen planners are involved in. They get together with the downtown business owners and the government, local government, to develop a downtown vision for what people want it to be, and then hopefully it gets adopted, and hopefully then it becomes something the government follows, right? So comprehensive plans, area plans, zoning codes, and development ordinances. What you get on the ground in your community is based on what your zoning code allows and permits, right? So in reality, if you start linking these things together and your vision in your comprehensive plan says we want our community to look like A, B, and C, then A, B, and C need to be spelled out here in the zoning code or the development ordinance, right? Then you also need to make sure that the community is then not giving away a ton of variances and rezonings to every developer that comes in the door, because you want them to continue to follow what the vision is, right? So we'll get into the board question in a second. So some are a little bit more complex. City of Buffalo's green code is a little bit more design-oriented, a little bit more about form, and you can get out to the older first-ring suburbs like the city of Tonawanda where I live, and it's the old Euclidean zoning where this use goes in this place, and that's that, right? So those things become the main key leverage points for communities to engage in planning at the local level and help to achieve sustainable outcomes at the regional level. The key point is that, and I sort of skipped over a little bit, the zoning code in your community legally has to be in accordance with a comprehensive plan. Those two things have to be linked, right? So most communities have a comprehensive plan because that is linked to the zoning code. Some places don't, right? And so communities that don't have a comprehensive plan can get away from having an actual document that's called a comprehensive plan, and it can actually be a host of smaller plans or fiscal analysis or environmental analysis that are in some way, shape, or form comprehensive that allow you to create a zoning code, right? So those are the tools. The key point is that I'll sort of use the city of Tonawanda example as how the issues can go awry. You need to develop the plans, and you need to be involved in the plans, but you also need to babysit the plans, right? You need to know what the boards are doing. So city of Tonawanda, turns out I was engaged with the city to review their development ordinance and their process, which is the way that they actually go about administering the codes. Well, it turns out that the council didn't want to deal with any of the backlash of giving away rezonings, so they were making the planning board hold the public hearing for the rezonings. Totally illegal. Totally illegal, right? The council didn't want the backlash, so they made the public hearing go to the planning board. The planning board tells the council what the public hearing outcome generally was, makes a recommendation, and then the council says, yeah, we're just going to follow their recommendation or vote for it or against it. But we're not going to hear from the public. Totally runs against state law. They have to be the entity that actually hears from the public if they're the one that's actually changing the law, right? A rezoning is change in law. So you have to be engaged, and you have to babysit, right? If you're not babysitting stuff like that, and then I was just in a meeting on that issue on Thursday, and the city attorney said, well, we've always done it that way. And I said, well, that's a political culture problem. That's not a legal problem. You got a political culture problem here. Just because you're doing it that way doesn't mean that that's actually legal, right? So the new administration came in and recognized some issues, and I've sort of stepped in to try to help them, try to get them to think a little differently. Whether they take my advice is a different issue altogether. Political culture again. So the Green Code becomes a good example, and One Region Forward is certainly a good example of coming together as individuals and as citizens and helping shape what you think you want your community to look like, right? And maybe at some point somebody can ask Nadine how many meetings were involved in the Green Code. I know it's been extensive meetings and workshops and social media and all those types of things. It's a very good, comprehensive public engagement process to create the vision for the city, right? That's where you have to step in. And if your community's in thinking about developing a new comp plan or a new zoning code, you have to step into that vacuum and push for public participation and push for engagement. So here's the sort of, I think is the key point, right? Because when the comp plan is done and the zoning code is done, the work still isn't done, right? Every single development plan and every single project in your community has to come through some sort of permitting process through a zoning board or planning board or even the city council or the town board for an approval, right? And that approval then should follow both legal requirements, like, the city council should be the one holding the public hearing on the rezoning, as in the case in the city of Tonawanda, but also that when you're doing these types of projects, it gives the public the opportunity to sort of step in and make sure that those boards are making the decisions that are based on what the community has said they want in the comp plan. So when they have a public hearing for a rezoning, you've got to go, right? That's your point. That's the opportunity for you to step in and say, okay, are we doing this right? And go to the microphone at the public hearing and have your say, right? Otherwise, you're leaving it to people in some of the outlying communities, not to sort of suggest a lack of sophistication, but in some of the outlying communities, the zoning and planning boards become the friends and family board, right? So, and what that means is basically that there's not a level of sophistication for land use planning and zoning at the community level, so they put their friends and family on the board, and they make decisions that they're not always certain about. And I've talked to boards in the suburbs and out in the rural communities, and that's generally the case. I'm not trying to pick on anyone. I'm just saying that that's generally the feel, right? So you have to, if you're engaged in the making of the comp plan and the passing of the zoning ordinance, and you push all those things through, then it might be a good idea to make sure that after all the work you've put in there, that you go to the planning board or you go to the zoning board and you watch how they work, right? And you make sure that you're the kind of checks and balances that are necessary to make sure that that project is done properly within the vision that you as a citizen planner or you as a taxpayer or you just as Joe Public feels necessary, right? So this is a good example, and I got called on this last year. I made a comment somewhere about thinking that demolition, my stance was that demolitions are necessary. And so that gets to the media in general, and that means that I think that we should just demo everything. So I get calls from the media all the time because I've said that demos are necessary. And that runs counter to maybe some people's ideas, but the economic reality is, less people, less money. I mean, some of these buildings have to go. So I get a call about this project in East Aurora. Anyone from East Aurora here? No? So a pizza shop decided they were going to buy this old historic building, knock it down, and create a parking lot. And so everybody went crazy. And it turns out it's a historic building. One of the owners, the original founders of Fisher-Price, owned the building. It's got some architectural significance, and they all went crazy. Well, what doesn't the village of East Aurora actually have to protect this? They don't actually have a historic preservation district or anything that actually would step in and be a mechanism to force some higher level sort of thinking about whether or not this is a justifiable use for this property, right? So everybody went crazy, and they got it to, actually made enough, sort of put enough pressure on the political system in East Aurora to actually turn the guy off, right? And so they turned him off, and from last I heard, within the last month, that the property is being sold, and somebody's going to buy it and fix it, right? And so the next step I hope that is going to happen in East Aurora is that then they go in and create that historic preservation district or put the policy in place so they don't have to keep doing this, right? Because my argument when the Buffalo News called, I said, well, listen, the guy has every right to knock this down. That might not be what you want to hear. That's his legal right to knock that building down. You have no local policy that says he can't. So he, as a pizza shop owner and a popular one, he was like, well, if I take everybody off in this community, my business might suffer, right? So he recognized that. He was smart enough to recognize it. But if it was an out-of-town investor, it's gone. And the city and the municipality had no tool actually in its toolbox to stop it, right? So, it's a good example of what happens, and I would argue is sort of in a reactionary manner to a problem. But, there needs to be, in a lot of communities, some proactive thinking about what happens if this comes up, right? And that's the leverage tool. So I think that should just about do it. These are, links that, I know there's some planning and zoning board members in the room. There's some good online resources for those that are interested in the relationship between zoning and the comprehensive plan. Long document spells out state law pretty clearly. And then there's the planner's web. Some probably are familiar with that. Very good sort of number of resources for those that consider themselves citizen planners. Things that you can think about, things that you can research, ways to kind of analyze some problems. So those are good, and I think that's it for me.